Shalom Aleinu ve'al kulam. V'yotzim mitzara b'irava. Yad le'velei ta'nireh ta'or shebashamayim. Anachnu ma'aminim b'nei ma'aminim ve'en lanu al mi lehishoel. מביאים את העניינים, מרימים את המסיבה, אנשים אחד לאנשים בתוך הרחבה, אז תרימו את הידיים אל השמיים, תנו לו בגבות, תנו לו גם בלי אותו שבלבלת אותי,
those guys. That was a continuation from yesterday's opening song, The Evolution of Jewish Music by the Y Studs. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Happy secular New Year. May 2021 be so much less interesting than 2020 was. And may it be a Torah-ful year, a healthy year, a sweet year, a prosperous and abundant year, a better year in every way, God willing. Let's light up the darkness. As many of you know, because I shared the story earlier today on the page, Nina and I met. I hope there's not a problem. Okay. Nina and I met 24 years ago on this night, New Year's Eve. So it really is an important celebration for us. We can't go to the restaurant bar where we happened to meet 24 years ago like we normally do. That's our New Year's tradition. But okay, you know, and God willing, we'll be able to do that again next year. The restaurant's been around for almost 100 years. That's El Coyote here in LA. Thank you so much to this group, this community, the Accidental Talmudist Daily community. You guys have been great, stepping up to help us meet our goal in the annual campaign. There's a few hours left for the 2 times matching. If you haven't donated yet and you're thinking about it, this is the moment. The 2 times matching is only in effect until midnight Pacific tonight. So it'd be really wonderful if you're thinking about donating to do it and trigger those matching funds. This is what the budget that we need so that we can produce AT Daily, The Table for Five, the Thursday Heroes, edited videos, so that we can grow our audience by marketing on Facebook and beyond and letting people know about what we do. Accounting, the website is a massive undertaking and is always needing upkeep, and we have a webmaster for that, etc. All of our staff and vendors, production people, etc. Everything costs money. If you love what we do, step up and donate, please. This is the moment. And Nina will put that link in the comments. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is dedicated by Saul Gerwitz here in LA, a wonderful member of our community, for the refuah, for the healing of Aliza Bas Fredel. And may she have a complete and speedy recovery, and may Hashem shower you and your family with brachas, with blessings from above, like rain, like dew, like the sweetness of the coming year. May it all fall on you in sweetness, Saul and your family. And we say Amen. The show is also dedicated by Darren and Karen Hollander in memory of Dr. Nicholas P. Vietz. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who was a loving husband, father, and doctor to thousands of people in Manchester, England, and his yahrzeit is on New Year's Eve. I believe we lost him 10 years ago tonight. Karen, I know he's near to you and in your heart. as he was, all his life, and we remember him. I wish I had met him, but as a community, we remember him fondly, and may the merit of our learning tonight accrue to his merit in heaven and carry him ever higher in the world of souls. And may blessings be showered on you, Karen and Darren, and your whole family from above. And we say amen. Who is going to be with us as we do some learning on New Year's Eve? How awesome that we're learning together on New Year's Eve. You guys are getting this year, or the coming year, started right. Pauline says shalom from Arkansas. Pauline, we received a beautiful, beautiful letter from you along with a donation. Thank you so much. I look forward to reading excerpts of that letter on the show in the coming days or weeks. John says Happy New Year from Sedona. Rochelle from Modesto. Sammy in Dallas. James says Shalom from Indianapolis. Chaim in Charlotte. Nancy in North Carolina. Dave, a non-Californicated Coloradan here. Melissa, Happy New Year's Eve. Bill, Shalom and a blessed New Year to everyone. May your every tear in 2021 be repaid in 2020. May your every tear in 2020 be repaid in 2021 with joy, and your every loss with hope. What a beautiful bracha, beautiful blessing, Bill. Chaim says good evening and good Shabbos. It's almost Shabbos. My goodness, it's tomorrow. Chana Rivka wishing you a good Shabbos and a wonderful New Year. Chaim says Happy New Year. Pauline, a happy, healthy, and joyous New Year. And from Merced, Steve says, where is Nina? Did you guys catch her today? We read the second half of the book of Proverbs. It was, we had some technical difficulties in the middle, but we got it done. It was a real good journey going through the wisdom of Solomon. We read the entire book of Proverbs between yesterday and today and really picked up those themes. A lot of the teachings just seem so, it's not a story, it's not a narrative, and yet the themes really stand out. Above all, avoid arrogance and pursue humility, pursue wisdom, associate with people with good values and who are pursuing wisdom. Disassociate yourself from people who just chase the gluttony of their lusts and just to feed themselves and accrue wealth for wealth's sake, etc. Avoid the company of people without values. Head to the company of people with good values. Those themes kept coming up over and over. Steve, right? Oh, yeah, sorry, he said, where's Nina? Adrian, L'chaim. Judith says, Shalom from Judith, recovering from surgery for a badly broken hip. Not that there's ever a goodly broken hip. Atta girl, Judith, you're keeping your sense of humor. May you have a complete and speedy recovery. We say amen. Larry's in Queens. Farah's with us from Pakistan. Nina's got the link in there. Lucy with us from Minnesota. Harold is wishing us a happy new year from him in Loretta. And John Boltman is here with us from Surfside Beach in South Carolina. Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey. Gail in Virginia. Wonderful. Welcome, everybody. Over there, come on. On the YouTube side, Neil in Virginia, Lynn in Texas, Sheila in Montana, and Charles says San Antonio in the house. Welcome, welcome, everybody. Okay. Tonight, where are we? This is Daf Mem, page 40 in Tractate Pesachim, the fourth volume of the Talmud. We're studying the laws of Passover. We're in chapter 2. Yesterday, we began and completed our discussion of Mishnah number 7. And tonight, we're doing Mishnah number 8. And it will open and complete our discussion of Mishnah number 8. So let's get to it. Excuse me. It's funny, it rained earlier this week in LA, but the air is very dry. Very dry. I've been getting chapped lips. Okay. Where are we? So, Mishnah number 8. Let me make a little space here. Okay. avoiding feedback, maybe like that. Okay. Let me know if there's any audio issues. I'll try to keep a look on the comments for that. And I saw Stephen, please pray for my cousin David Pertel, who has end-stage stomach cancer and COVID-19. I'm so sorry to hear that, Stephen. May your cousin David make a full, perhaps miraculous, but a full recovery from those conditions. And we say amen. All right, Mishnah number 8 here in chapter 2. One may not soak coarse bran for feeding chickens lest it be leavened. So the whole thing that we're talking about here is leavened bread on Passover. A Jew cannot have leavened bread, leavened grain in his possession on Passover. Normally we think of leavened bread, okay, puffy bread that has yeast in it, etc. But as we've talked about a bunch of times, for the sages, in terms of the 5 grains that qualify for matzah, wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats, if they simply come into contact with water for an extended amount of time, there's going to be some amount of leavening, a bit of fermentation leavening that happens, and then it is not purely unleavened bread. And it's not purely an unleavened grain, right? It's not even that you made dough and baked it into bread. But just if the grain or the dough at any point is going to come into contact with water and be in contact with it for too long a time, it's going to be considered leavened. And that doesn't only apply to our food for people. It also applies in this agrarian society to the feed for our animals, as we read here. So one may not soak coarse bran for feeding chickens lest it be leavened. Right? So the chickens are going to essentially be on a matzah diet also. However, one may pour boiling water onto the bran before feeding it to the chickens, as it will not become leavened from this brief exposure. Okay, so it's not like we're going to make the chickens suffer and not eat the food that they are accustomed to eating. It's just that we're going to use a procedure where we're going to be careful that whereas normally we would take that bran and soak it for a while to soften it up before giving it to the chickens, and we don't care if it's soaking for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, it doesn't matter during the rest of the year, but now during Passover, we're going to make sure that even the chicken feed doesn't have a chance to leaven. And a woman may not soak coarse bran to bring by hand to the bathhouse for use as a cleanser. There's a peek into the ancient world, right? They were using bran as a cleanser. However, she may rub coarse bran on her dry skin. Likewise, the sages said, a person may not chew wheat and place it on his wound due to the fact that the wheat will become leavened from the saliva of his chewing. So that's how careful they're going to be not to mix grain and moisture in a way that can produce a leavened grain. Now we go into the Gemara. The sages taught the following foods do not come to a state of leavening. Foods that have already been baked or boiled or overboiled in hot water. With regard to the statement that boiled food will not become leavened, the Gemara asks, why not? When it is boiled, it will become leaven, right? If you're boiling some kind of a grain, it's certainly mixing with water and it can become leaven. And the Gemara answers that Rav Papa said, the Tana merely said that if it was first baked and afterward boiled, it will not be leavened. However, if it was initially boiled, yes, it will become leavened. Okay. Now we're going to skip forward a little bit in our daf and continue. The sages taught one may not soak barley in water on Passover to make it easier to remove the chaff from the grain. Okay, so I'm not a farmer. I don't understand this so well, but I get the concept, right? That if you soak barley in water, it's going to be easier to remove the chaff from the grain. It must have been part of the process of removing the grain from the chaff, but that process is not going to be permitted on Passover, right? Now, I'm sure that what a lot of people did is, if they're faced with the choice of harvest the barley in a very inefficient way, or just take a week off from this kind of work, okay, so maybe they would take a week off. But if for some reason they had to, maybe because they needed it for the purposes of Passover itself, during Passover, okay, so then they're going to have to use a different procedure than what they're normally accustomed to. However, if one did soak barley grain and it split, it is prohibited. If it did not split, it is permitted, right? So again, I don't know so much about barley, but this idea that if it did not split, so then water didn't really get inside it, and according to the definition of leaven and leaven attaching to grain in this situation, if it didn't split, it's not a problem. If it did, it is. Okay, so Rabbi Yosei says, if one sees that the grain is expanding, he should soak it in vinegar, and the vinegar will cause the grain to contract, thereby preventing leavening. However, Shmuel said the halacha is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei. Rav Chisda said that Mar Ukva said, when the sages were referring to a case where the barley grain split, the prohibition does not apply, only if it actually split and a crack is visible. Rather, this is referring even to a case where if the barley grains were placed on a barrel of wine, they would split by themselves due to the effect of the wine. And by contrast, Shmuel said, this halacha applies only if it actually split. The Gemara relates, Shmuel took action in accordance with his ruling when he was in the village of Bar Chashu's house. He prohibited only wheat grains that had actually split, but permitted those that were about to split. So the sages are taking very careful measures to make sure that wheat and barley and other grains in their various stages of processing, from growing in the field until grain being sold in the market, and then it'll be kneaded and turned into dough and into bread. In all these different stages, they're going to be very careful that during Passover, during the week-long festival of Passover, it doesn't come into contact with moisture. Rabbah said a pious person will not soak wheat at all during Passover. The Gemara asks, well, why discuss particularly a pious person? This halakha should apply to everyone as well, as it was expressly taught in a baraisa, one may not soak barley on Passover. The Gemara answers that this is what Rabbah is saying. A pious person will not even soak wheat, which is firmer than barley and less likely to split, due to the concern that it might become leaven. Rav Nachman said to Rabbah, anyone who listens to Abba, which is Rabbah's first name, will end up eating moldy bread during Passover, as flour cannot be properly prepared without soaking, and therefore matzah should not be prepared from this flour. As in Rav Huna's house, they would soak the grain, and in Rav Bar Avin's house, they would likewise soak their grain. But Rabbah said, soaking grain should not be avoided merely for reasons of piety. Rather, it is absolutely prohibited to soak grain. So soaking the grain is definitely an inherent part of the normal process of getting the grain from the field to where it's, we can make dough out of it. But it's very problematic on Passover. And yet the sages are disagreeing. How problematic is it? Is it really going to leaven? Can we be careful enough? Can we time it? Can we introduce vinegar if it's starting to get to a place where it would qualify as leavening? Can we pass, rulings? Can we make rulings that are going to go out into the population? And even though it would work for a meticulous person, is it somehow going to lead the average person possibly into a transgression of having leavened bread in their homes during Passover? This is what's going on between them. Now, Rav is being very stringent. He says, no, you can't soak it. This soaking process, even though it seems to be normally the thing for processing the grain and eventually even making matzah out of it, it's just too dangerous and we shouldn't do it. The Gemara asks, rather, that which is taught in a baraisa, One may not soak barley at Passover. It indicates that it is barley that one may not soak. However, it is permitted to soak wheat. How will Rav explain this Baraisa? And the Gemara explains the Baraisa is speaking, employing the didactic style of needless to say. It should be understood as follows. Needless to say, wheat may not be soaked, since wheat grains have a slit through which water will enter, and the wheat will therefore expand quickly when left to soak. However, in the case of barley, which is smooth, and no water will enter the grain, one might say that this seems well, i.e. it is permitted to soak barley. Therefore, the Baraisa teaches us that it is prohibited to soak even barley. Rava reconsidered. Right? Rava was being stringent, but maybe he was allowing, now I'm confused. Which was he allowing? The wheat? I think he was saying no barley, yes wheat. But now they're saying, no, it can't be either one. So Rava reconsidered and then said, this is not the case. Rather, it is permitted to soak grain. As it was taught in a Baraisa, one can fulfill his obligation with a matzah loaf prepared with refined flour and with matzah baked from coarse flour. And it is impossible to produce refined matzah without soaking the grain, as this is the only way to remove the chaff completely from the grain. So now we're learning that refined flour means that the chaff is completely removed. That's why it's not coarse. It's only the grain. None of the chaff is left. And now we're learning, well, to do that, to achieve that, and we'd like to beautify the mitzvah of eating matzah, so we'd like to have it made from refined flour. We've already discussed that does not violate the requirement that we eat lechem oni, poor man's bread, right? So refined flour is okay. What's prohibited for fulfilling our obligation to eat matzah on the first night of Passover is if we mix wine, oil, or honey into it. But it is good to eat refined flour, even as fine a flour as King Solomon himself would eat. We learned that a few days ago. So where are we? In order to have this really refined flour, it needed to be soaked in water. But if it's soaked in water, we risk that it was leavened at some level. Rav Papa raised an objection to the opinion of Rava. Perhaps this latest opinion where he permitted the soaking for the purpose of refining the flour. Rav Papa raised an objection to the opinion of Rava from a Baraisa. With regard to flour and refined flour that belong to Gentiles in villages, they are ritually pure, and in cities, they are ritually impure. It is assumed that grain in cities is soaked before it is ground into flour. Once water comes into contact with this grain, it becomes susceptible to ritual impurity, and it subsequently becomes impure when touched by Gentiles. So what the Gemara is talking about here is if we have grain, now we're leaving the question of leaven for a moment. We're going to bring in this teaching to answer our question about leavening. But what we're talking about is tuma, ritual impurity. And grain cannot become ritually impure until it comes into contact with one of the 7 liquids that render a food susceptible to impurity. So if it stayed completely dry from the time it was harvested until whenever we're talking about it, then it could not have become impure. It could not have become tameh. But if it came into contact with moisture, then it was prepared. It became susceptible to tuma. And when they're talking about the difference between Jews and Gentiles, what they're saying is, well, Jews who have a law against eating ritually impure foods, remember, ritual impurity has nothing to do with hygiene or dirt or health or anything like that. It simply means that it has never come into contact with anything that has come into contact with any source of ritual impurity, like a dead creeping thing or a dead human body or somebody who had certain conditions themselves. It has nothing to do with health or disease or hygiene, only with ritual purity. Jews have to guard against this, at least in the ancient times when the temple stood. But there's no law at all that commands non-Jews to even care about these issues. They're not issues. They're only commanded for Jews. So if it's in the possession of non-Jews and they have no reason to guard against tuma, we're going to have to assume that it's possible that food became tameh. and and therefore it might be, right? It has the possibility of tuma. And what he's saying is, well, in the cities, it was the custom to definitely soak these grains. They had become wet, therefore they were prepared for impurity. But in the towns, it was not that custom to soak them, and therefore they remained dry. And a Jew could purchase that dry grain from non-Jews who lived in towns because they did not have the custom of soaking it in water. As for flour in villages, what is the reason that it is ritually pure? Right? Why is it ritually pure in the villages? Do they really not use water in their process? Is it not due to the fact that they do not soak the flour, and therefore it does not become liable to tuma, to ritual impurity? And yet their flour is nonetheless called refined flour. It can be inferred from this that it is possible to prepare refined flour without soaking the grain. So Rav Papa is saying to Rava, you're saying that we have to allow soaking of the flour in water in order to get refined flour, but apparently there is a way of producing refined flour without soaking it in water. Rava answered, you should interpret the distinction of the Baraisa as referring only to ordinary flour, not refined flour, which is invariably susceptible to ritual impurity due to the soaking. After Rava left, Rav Papa said, what is the reason that he did not say a proof from this statement that Rabbi Zera said, that Rav Yirmiyah said, that Shmuel said, with regard to wheat that will be used for meal offerings, one may not soak it, and yet it is nonetheless called refined flour. Now we're looking not at the law of purity per se, nor of leaven, but the meal offerings, the bread and flour offerings that were brought on the altar in the holy temple. That anything you're offering the temple has to be the finest possible version of it. So if you're talking about a bread offering, and we talked about that's unleavened bread, but it also needs to come from refined flour. Rava reconsidered. And then he said, it is not only permitted to soak the grains, it is actually a mitzvah to soak them. As it is stated, Exodus 12:17, and you shall guard the matzahs. The Gemara explains this statement. If it is not the case that grain requires soaking, for what purpose is guarding necessary? If you claim that this verse is referring to guarding when kneading it, that cannot be the case, as guarding the grain while kneading is not considered guarding. If one failed to protect the wheat from being leavened up to that point, it is of no use to be careful while kneading it. At that point, it's already too late, right? You needed to make sure that it didn't come into contact with moisture prior to the stage where you're actually kneading the dough. Remember, there's obviously going to be no yeast in it. So if one failed to protect from that point, consequently, the mitzvah of guarding the matzahs is to guard the dough. To guard the dough cannot be referring to the kneading stage. It must be referring that we guard it from the time it's harvested until it becomes flour and we turn it into dough. It's during that stage of the process that one is guarding it, according to the commandment in the Torah, Exodus 12:17. What are we guarding against? That it comes into contact with moisture for an extended amount of time. So since we're guarding it and we want to have refined flour, now Rava says it must be a mitzvah, a commandment to make it the best matzah that it can be, and therefore soaking the grain is not only not prohibited, not only permitted, it is commanded, says Rava at this stage. As Rav Huna said, in the case of dough prepared by Gentiles, if one knows that it has not become leaven, a person may fill his stomach with them on Passover night, provided that he eats at least an olive bulk of matzah at the end to fulfill the obligation to eat matzah. And the Gemara infers from this statement, with regard to the matzah that he eats at the end, yes, he fulfills his obligation with this matzah, but with regard to the matzah he ate in the beginning, no, he does not fulfill the matzah, the mitzvah, with the dough prepared by Gentiles. In other words, if you get dough, if you make matzah, right? You need to eat matzah on the first night. But if the matzah that you're eating on the first night was made by non-Jews, even if you can guarantee that it is unleavened, it's still, therefore it's permissible to eat it during the festival of Passover, during the 7-day festival when we can only eat unleavened bread. So if you have a guarantee from the non-Jews that made it, that it is unleavened, that it never had a chance to leaven, from them, yes, you can eat it. It's permitted to eat it. But no, you have not fulfilled your obligation to eat matzah on the first night. Why? Because the non-Jew had no commandment on him to guard the matzah from the time that the grain was harvested in the field until it became a dough that was kneaded and then baked. And what is the reason that one cannot fulfill his obligation to eat matzah with dough prepared by Gentiles? It is because he did not perform his duty to guard this dough, the one who eats. But one can perform his duty to guard it from the time of baking and onward. Rather, isn't it correct to conclude from this baraisa that the grain must be guarded from the beginning, i.e. from the time it is soaked, which proves that soaking the grain is part of the process of preparing matzah? The Gemara rejects this logic and says, from where do we know that this conclusion is correct? Perhaps it is different there at the time when guarding is required, i.e. when water was added to the flour. He did not perform his duty to guard it properly. However, in a case where at the time when guarding is required, when water is added to the flour, he properly performed his duty to guard it, so too it is possible that guarding flour at the time of kneading is considered proper guarding, right? So maybe you don't have to guard it from the time it's in the field. Maybe it's enough that you're just guarding it at the time that you're kneading it, that now you're introducing the water on purpose and making flour. And at that point, you're making sure that from the time you mix the water and the flour to make dough, that it doesn't have enough time to rise before you roll it out, form the matzah, and throw it in the oven to bake it. Maybe that's enough to fulfill your obligation to guard this grain, and you don't have to guard it from the time that it was harvested in the field, etc. And although this proof, And although this proof was rejected, Rava did not retract his statement that guarding grain must begin before kneading, for he would say to those who cut and tied the stalks of grain in the field, when you cut the grain, cut it for the purpose of the mitzvah. Cut it for the purpose of the mitzvah. L'shem mitzvah. Right? That even when you're harvesting in the field, it's not just, well, we're going to harvest a whole field full of grain, and some of it is going to be for matzah, and some of it is eventually just going to be for bread for the rest of the year. But pick a part of the field where the grain that you're harvesting at that time, you're thinking already, this is going to be for the matzah of Passover, and you're doing it in the name of the mitzvah. You're in your mind already selecting that this particular area of the field is for matzah. I'm harvesting for matzah. I'm going to be separating the grain from the chaff for matzah. I'm going to keep it dry for the sake of the matzah all the way through. And apparently, Rava maintains that it is necessary to guard the grain from the outset, i.e., from the beginning of its preparation until the end. Now, let's read where the halacha, the law, ended up. Soaking grain on Passover. It seems like in order to get the finest grain for the finest matzah, it would be permitted to soak the grain. That's what the discussion seems to have pointed to. However, one may not soak wheat or barley for use during Passover. Although the Gemara appears to permit this activity, the Geonim forbade it. The Geonim are the leaders of the Jewish community in that period from about 600, the year 600, to about the year 1000. Right? So they were the great Gedolim, the biggest rabbis, the rabbis with authority in those generations. That's the next group after the rabbis of the Talmud. And they said, no soaking the wheat or barley. We can't make sure that leaven doesn't happen, so we don't do that. In terms of guarding the matzah, The wheat for the matzah that a person will use to fulfill his obligation should be kept from water from the time it is harvested, or at least from when it is ground into flour, in accordance with Rava's statement. Some people are strict and use only this type of matzah throughout the entire festival. Again, distinguishing between the matzah that we're obligated to eat on the first night and then the matzah that we're just permitted to eat the rest of the festival. We don't have to eat bread. We don't have to eat at all. But if you're going to eat bread, it has to be unleavened bread. That's going to be of a less stringent nature than what we are obligated to eat on the first night. Now, the title of tonight's episode is Shmura Matzah worth the extra shekels? When I was growing up, we were not Orthodox, we're not particularly religious. We did eat matzah during Passover. We did not eat bread during Passover in my home. But like I think many American Jewish homes that are not frum, that are not Orthodox, the standard matzah that you eat, and it's perfectly kosher to eat it, is the square matzah that comes in the box. It's kosher for Passover. It's, very regularly square shaped, and it comes, all the matzahs the same size and fit in a square box. But when Nina and I, in our journey to becoming more observant Jews, at a certain point, we encountered the community, and people were getting this very expensive and really cool looking Shmura Matzah, which I gotta say tastes a lot better than the square matzah and looks completely different. Instead of squares that are about this big, let's say, they're circles that are about this big around, much bigger, and circular and uneven. And they're called Shmura Matzah. And what does Shmura Matzah mean? Guarded, watched, that it was watched, right? That it fulfills these stringencies that we're talking about here on our daf. I don't have any to show you right now. But when Passover comes close, starting about a month before Passover, definitely in 3 or 2 weeks to go to Passover. If you live in a community that's big enough, a Jewish community, and even if you don't, you can get it through the mail. You can get Shmura Matzah. Usually it comes in a really big box that looks almost like a pizza box with lots of paper wrapping inside to try to keep it from breaking. And it's great. It's much better matzah. It tastes better. It's finer. And what makes it Shmura Matzah is that people have been following what Rava said. They're watching it from the time it's harvested and all through the production chain, that it never comes into contact with moisture of any kind except at the times when it needs to, like when it's being turned into dough and then kneaded quickly and then baked. And that matzah, which costs a lot more, is understood to have an added infusion of faith and sanctity. Isn't that beautiful? The bread has an added infusion of faith and sanctity. So people are not, transgressing in any way when they eat the kind of traditional square matzah at the Seder on Passover. But if you can get the Shmura Matzah, it's worth the extra shekels. It really is. It tastes better. It feels, it's so much more authentic on your Seder table. And it really heightens the whole experience of Passover to get Shmura Matzah. And now you know what Shmura Matzah means, that it was guarded from the outset against coming into contact with moisture that might have caused it to leaven. And I'll just note one last thing that's kind of funny. So when I went to, I always put an emoji in the titles of the episodes of of AT Daily. And I was thinking, I'm gonna say something about Shmura Matzah. What should be the emoji? I guess I'll use a couple of eyeballs because obviously there's no matzah emoji. So I put in the eyeballs and I was typing is Shmura Matzah, and then my iPhone pops up an emoji of round matzah. I couldn't believe it. I was stunned that Apple and the emoji world has a Shmura Matzah emoji. How cool is that? And so there you see it in the title. On Facebook, it looks like a circle like head on. And on my iPhone, it's like a little bit angled. But it's a Shmura Matzah emoji. Who knew? How cool is that? Okay. Just a couple of last short thoughts. And then we'll go to your comments and questions. Short excerpts from this daf. So we also have the sages taught one may not stir flour into a pot of food on Passover to absorb the foam that has accumulated during the cooking process. I guess it's something cooks do. But you can't do it on Passover because you're adding flour to like a stew or to some kind of liquid in your cooking pot, and that might cause that flour to leaven. And one who wishes to stir flour should add the flour and afterward add vinegar, which will prevent the flour from becoming leavened. And some say one may even add vinegar and afterward add the flour, as vinegar prevents the flour from becoming leavened, even after the flour is diluted in water. Ula said, in both of these cases, whether the vinegar is added first or afterward, its use is prohibited, as one must avoid scenarios that might lead to a prohibition, as per the well-known adage, go around, and do not approach the vineyard, they say to the Nazir. In other words, somebody who has taken a vow not to drink wine or benefit from the grapevine in any way, don't go walking through a vineyard, right? If you know that alcohol is a problem for you, don't walk into a bar. If you know that overeating is a problem for you, don't walk into, some kind of all-you-can-eat smorgasbord. If you know, whatever your particular thing is, don't come near to sin. Make a fence around it. Distance yourself from sin. Literally, distance yourself from it. And Ula is saying, adding flour to a cooking pot where there's liquid in it and relying on the vinegar to keep the flour from leavening, too dangerous, because people might not add enough vinegar. They might forget to add the vinegar. They just see that flour is being added to a cooking pot and they're like, oh, I guess I can add flour to the cooking pot, and they will come to have leavened grain on Passover. And what is the law? One may not stir flour into a pot of food, even if he adds vinegar afterward. However, it is permitted to add baked matzah to a pot of food, as stated by Ula and Rava. And that is all I had to share tonight. Coming to your comments and questions tomorrow with God's help. New Year's Day, we'll be meeting it's Friday, so we'll be meeting at noon Pacific. Normal schedule for us. And continuing with Daf Mem Aleph, page 41 here in chapter 2. Okay, let's go to comments and questions. Looks like only one question. Oh no, here they come. Okay. Bill Eldridge, speaking of Proverbs, your videos inspired me to incorporate Proverbs into my daily prayer cycle. Noon prayer in my tradition's prayer book is both a little light but also highly flexible. So one of my resolutions for 2021 is to read one chapter of Proverbs every day at noon prayers. Since there are only 31 chapters, that should mean I get through them about once a month. Beautiful, 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 Bill. May you be strengthened in this project and in this resolution. I think that's great. All the best to you on that. Sharon Frant Brooks, I used to have a Hevruta study partner whose husband was a rabbi, who was a shomer, a guard, for the purpose of making Shmura Matzah. He was responsible for making sure the wheat was properly watched from harvest to completion of the matzah. I was totally impressed by the fastidiousness of the work. No wonder Shmura Matzah is so expensive. Carolyn Dobson Chavez, thank you both for reading the Proverbs earlier. A great way to head into 2021. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Carolyn. And thank you, Bill. You guys are always... And thank you to everybody who participates, not only in here and, listening to the whole class, but the asking questions and the making comments and, enriching this discussion part of the class at the end of every class. I really appreciate it. Thank you to all of you. And also to Julie Christensen, who says, it's like Ah, beautiful. So she's saying it's like that we're in God's garden and he sets us apart to purify our hearts, separating the wheat from the taurus, but I guess I mean by the chaff, right? So certainly separating the wheat from the chaff, the grain from the chaff, it's a metaphor that's been used a long time, right? In a faith context. Also removing the dross from the silver, which was mentioned in Proverbs several times. But that's right. I think what's really beautiful about that is, so we're always trying to distance ourselves from sin. We're trying to remove impurity from our lives. We're trying to remove our arrogance, right? All those times that we slip, that we're lazy, that we're arrogant, that we're, whatever our particular faults are, and we're trying to separate ourselves from those faults. But I think what we can learn from today's page is we're not going to be able to separate ourselves from our faults just by saying, I want to separate myself from my faults. It's going to take a shomer, right? It's going to take being on guard against any intrusion, of the moisture that could set us up for failure, of any of the chaff that could set us up for failure. It takes work, right? It takes work. If we're going to really make a shift in our personality, in our attributes, in our ways of being, it's going to take work and constant watchfulness. My friends, if you're making a New Year's resolution on New Year's Eve, right, when we're going to party and perhaps have a few drinks, the most likely thing is that tomorrow that resolution will be forgotten and won't go far. How many resolutions actually stick? So I've talked in the past. New Year's Eve, it's great. I love it. Nita and I met on New Year's Eve. It really is a celebration for us. But for resolutions that stick, don't rely on New Year's Eve. Think about Passover. Think about Rosh Hashanah. Think about major milestones where you're going to have a chance to prepare, transform, and then incorporate the change into life, right? Passover is beautiful for that because we start thinking about Passover 30 days before Passover. Then on Passover, we pray to God and thank Him for liberating us from enslavement. And we are enslaved to bad habits. So when we're trying to make a resolution, it's because we're trying to break a bad habit, right? So we ask God to help us break that enslavement. And then we start counting the Omer on the second night of Passover and count for 50 days and reflect each day on our attributes and whether we're really growing in menshiness, in humanity, in faith, in decreasing arrogance, increasing humility, reflecting every day for 50 days and asking ourselves, are we really making progress? Likewise, at Rosh Hashanah, we start thinking about it 30 days before. Then we go into the days of awe where we're really standing before God and know that we're being examined and therefore examining ourselves. And then we go live in a sukkah, a fragile structure for a week where we're acknowledging not only are we always in the hands of God, and that's a physical way to understand that, but in terms of resolutions to make changes in our lives, that often come about during that period of self-examination between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that whatever conclusion we come to of a change we want to make in our lives, that change, that new me, is fragile. And it will not stick unless we pray for help on a regular basis and organize our lives to make that change so that it will stick. So if you're really planning on doing that tonight, then along with it, get out your little notebook or your journal and get organized about what you're going to do to make that resolution stick. Because the resolution by itself, it's a weak proposition. But a resolution accompanied by an organized process of self-examination and guarding one's habits to become that new you, that has a chance to succeed. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us tonight. May you have a wonderful New Year's Eve and a wonderful 2021. May it be a Torah-full year. May it be a less interesting year than 2020, but a much sweeter, healthier, more joyful, more meaningful, more, awesome year for all of us. All the best to you. Take care.